Dating someone new can be challenging, because you never truly know what they're like until you meet in person. Sometimes, red flags or concerning behaviors can show up right from the start. What were some immediate red flags on the first date that made you not go on a second date? Welcome back to our channel. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Story 1. He got arrested for shoplifting right in front of me. Edit for clarification. I really wish I was making this up, lol. He didn't actually shoplift in front of me, he just got arrested. I was around 19 or 20 at the time and pretty naive. I'm 30 now. I had known this guy for a few weeks and we decided to go out for dinner. On our way there, he wanted to stop at GameStop to make a return and I thought, okay, no problem. But it turned out he actually went in to steal about $500 worth of merchandise. I had no idea what was going on. I thought he was just making a return, so I stayed in the car while he was inside. I guess the store employee must have seen him walk back to my car because, within a minute, a cop pulled up next to us and tapped on my passenger window. The officer asked for his driver's license and started running it. I asked him, "What did you do?" And he responded, "Oh, I just have some unpaid parking tickets." As the first officer was checking his information, an unmarked car pulled up next to mine, and another officer or detective came over to pull me out of the car and started questioning me. He must have thought I was involved, like I was his getaway driver or something. I turned around to see him being pulled out of the car and handcuffed. The police were very nice to me since I was honest and cooperative, and they could tell I had no idea what was happening. They let me go home without further trouble. I didn't find out what he was actually arrested for until I looked it up online later. It turns out he had stolen $500 worth of merchandise from GameStop and had 3 outstanding warrants for assault charges. I definitely dodged a bullet there. Story 2. A guy I'd been friends with for a couple of years asked me out. We knew each other, so we should have been able to have a fairly normal night out, but no. We met at a bar/restaurant and sat at the bar. He ordered all-meat appetizers despite me being a vegetarian and said, "You can eat this or go hungry." I ordered my own food. Die Hard was just starting to play on the TV, and he asked me if I liked it. I admitted that I had never seen Die Hard, and he proceeded to describe the entire movie in real time. I am not exaggerating. I was not allowed to speak while he explained every single detail of the movie while the movie was playing silently on the bar TV. I'd had too much to drink to leave early and drive home, so I just sat there and endured his 2-hour monologue while I slowly sobered up. When the movie finally, mercifully finished, he asked the bartender for his check and said, "I'm not paying for her, though." The bartender brought his check and then told me I didn't owe anything. After my date left, the bartender said it was one of the most painful things he'd ever witnessed and apparently, he and some of the servers had been placing bets about how long this guy would actually talk about Die Hard. I'm just glad I had a witness because it was so ridiculous. There was no second date and he literally never talked to me again. Story 3. I went on a Tinder date where, after the first few minutes of small talk, the conversation took a dark turn. Without any provocation or real engagement from me, he spent the next hour ranting about how much he hated women. He complained that women just want to date jerks and ignore nice guys like me, all while using derogatory terms like dumb slut and bis and referring to them as females. He went on about how women only go on dates for free food, and just kept digging himself deeper. I stayed silent the whole time, probably with a very awkward smile on my face, just trying to get through the meal. I didn't let him pay for my food, and when he walked me to my car, he started raving about how I was the coolest chick he'd ever been on a date with and even tried inviting me back to his house. But something in me snapped. I realized the parking lot was busy, and I used that sense of safety to finally speak up. I asked him if the only reason he thought I was cool was because I didn't say a single word the whole date. I told him that his behavior made me physically uncomfortable and that he was speaking so loudly I felt humiliated. I said it was one of the worst dates I'd ever been on and that he didn't deserve a girlfriend, especially since he clearly hated women. I told him he sounded like a whiny jerk, and it was shocking how he managed to paint himself as the victim in every story he told when, honestly, he was the one being the jerk. I went off on him, maybe a bit too hard. Because, well, he started crying. Story 4. A friend of a friend asked me out on a date at a random barbecue, and he seemed pretty chill, so I thought, why not? The day before, he told me it's a fancy place, so dress up. Now I'm more of a casual first date kind of person, usually opting for jeans, but he seemed really excited about the idea, so I figured, okay, this could be fun. I'll roll with it. So, I borrow a beautiful dress, do my hair and makeup, and get all glammed up. He picks me up from my friend's house, I borrowed the dress from her, but when he shows up, He's in jeans and a t-shirt. I'm thinking, wait, didn't you say it was fancy? But I shrug it off, maybe he has a thing against collared shirts, who knows. We drive for about 15 minutes, and I'm thinking we're headed to this fancy place he mentioned, but nope. We ended up at the mall. He's chatting away the whole time, but I just assume he's nervous. I think, maybe the restaurant is inside the mall? Nope. We walk into the food court, and he leads me to an Italian pizza place. Fancy? Not exactly. There I am, sitting in a little black dress with full makeup, while everyone around us is in shorts and tank top. I feel so out of place, and people keep staring and laughing. I try to stay positive, thinking maybe his personality will make up for the mix-up on fancy. At the counter, I try to go Dutch, but he insists on paying, acting all weird about it. Fine, I let it go. But when he comes back to the table with the food, he switches out my pizza order for a side salad, talking about how I should be more health-conscious as he digs into a double pepperoni stuffed crust pizza. Okay, now I'm starting to get a better sense of the guy. Then, the whole date turns into him monologuing non-stop. I'm talking hours of him barely pausing for a breath. I'm pretty sure he was more interested in telling me about the pets he's had, his favorite archery bow, and his family's medical history than asking me a single thing about myself. I couldn't even remember if he knew my name at this point. After about 30 minutes of this, I decided it was time to leave. I tried to make a polite exit, thanking him for the date, all while awkwardly scooting out of the booth. Suddenly, he panics and yells, "Wait, you haven't seen my tattoo," and whips off his shirt, revealing 2 blue tissues on his rib cage. I'm just frozen, staring at this oddity, and without thinking, I blurt out, "Why do you have a Kleenex tattoo?" He completely loses it. Turns out, they were supposed to be manta rays, but the artist must have been on something because they looked like a disaster. He's yelling about how disrespectful I am, accusing me of being too stuck up and fancy to appreciate his art. At that point, I didn't need another reason to leave, so I just noped out of there. The next day, a mutual friend brought me a small dog plushie from him, with an apology and a request for another date. I did not accept. LOL. Story 5. I was planning a first date with a guy a few years ago, and he suggested going bowling. I told him it was fine, though I'd only been once before, and I wasn't great at it. The group I was with at the time still had fun, even though I wasn't very coordinated. He offered to teach me how to bowl, but I declined, saying I just wanted to enjoy a relaxed evening and get to know him better. He suggested we still go bowling, but without the lessons so we could just laugh at my lack of skill. I was on board with that idea. When the night came, however, the lessons started right away. He kept pointing out how I should stand, where I should stand, and all the things I was doing wrong. He said I wasn't taking it seriously enough, and that he was trying to teach me for my own good. He seemed to get more and more serious and even a little critical. There wasn't a lot of joy, except for the moments when he saw me struggling. I told him this wasn't the fun, laid-back evening I had been hoping for. He responded by saying it would be more enjoyable if I took the game more seriously. By the end of the night, he was clearly frustrated, and it wasn't the relaxed date I had been looking for. Story 6. I met someone on social media who I had a lot of friends in common with, but we'd never met in person. He asked me out, and we decided to meet at Barnes & Noble to grab coffee and pick out books. We were both big readers. He was incredibly attractive and seemed really into me, so I was excited. We met up, and within the first few minutes, he asked if he could kiss me. I agreed, and it was a great moment, instant chemistry. We continued talking, but soon he started to act a bit too forward, getting physically too close, making me uncomfortable with some of his actions. While those types of gestures are fine when you're comfortable with someone, they were a little much for a first date. I tried to keep things light and told him I wanted to take it slow and get to know him better, but he kept pushing, and it just didn't feel right. At one point, he made a comment about going to the bathroom together, which made me uncomfortable, and I decided it was time to leave. When I mentioned I had to go to work, he tried to convince me to skip my job and spend the day with him instead, even suggesting that once we were married, I wouldn't have to work. That was a huge red flag for me, so I told him this wasn't going to work out. He became angry and stormed off, and by the time I got to my car, he had already removed me from all social media. I'm not sure exactly why he was so upset. Maybe it was because I didn't want to take things to a level I wasn't comfortable with, or because I had my own job and didn't plan to drop everything for him. Whatever the reason, it was clear that he wasn't the right match for me. Story 7. This entire experience happened during our first and last date, and it just kept going downhill. First, when the food arrived, he immediately asked for it to be remade because it wasn't cooked exactly how he wanted. And then, he ended up sending the remade dish back and ordered something else instead. Major red flag. Then, His phone lit up and I saw a picture of two young girls. I asked if they were his nieces, and he said they were actually his 2-year-old and 4-year-old daughters, which he had never mentioned before, even though I had asked if he had any kids. Another red flag. Next, he casually mentioned that he still lives with his ex/baby mama and had no plans to live apart anytime soon. Oh, and they were living in his parents' basement. Extreme red flag. The conversation then took a bizarre turn when he started talking about how much he dislikes the left wing because it doesn't favor white men like himself. He then went on to say how immigrants ruined this country. Mind you, I'm Middle Eastern, and my parents are immigrants. Definitely a red flag. When we talked about traveling, he nonchalantly said, "You probably have to leave so much earlier for the airport because of security, right?" I asked him what he meant, and he responded, "You know, 9/11. Gotta be extra safe, you know?" This was an incredibly backhanded and racist comment, another red flag. At that point, the red flags turned into checkered flags, telling me it was time to leave. So, without responding any further, I grabbed my coat, thanked him for the free meal, and walked out. Story 8. I went on a first date with a woman who told me up front, I expect anyone I date to buy me things, not just small gestures like flowers, but actually going to the mall and purchasing all kinds of stuff for her. And, to top it off, she was a psychologist. It made me cringe to think about someone trusting her professionally. Then, there was a second woman I dated for a few months, so not a first date, but still early in our relationship. After about 4 months, she casually mentioned that she wouldn't be with anyone who made less than $100,000. This was around 2009, so adjusting for inflation, probably closer to $150,000 now. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I worked as a scientist, so I asked, if we were married and I lost my job in biotech but took an academic position as a professor making $75,000, would you leave me? She said yes without hesitation. I didn't waste another second and ended things that day. Story 9. We met up at his place, where he was preparing dinner for me. We were chatting on the couch when he stood up to excuse himself to the restroom. As he walked away, he casually mentioned something about cameras in his house and added, "Just don't take anything," before pointing to a stack of papers on the end table. "I believe in being open," he said. "That's my background check. Everything's right there." Then he went on his way. I considered leaving right then, but I stayed. Out of curiosity, I picked up the stack of papers. To my surprise, it was a detailed record of several incidents spanning multiple states. Most of the charges were related to domestic issues, with a few involving weapons, some minor drug offenses, and assault charges. When he returned, I was lucky that my phone rang. I answered it, even though I didn't recognize the number. I pretended it was a call from one of my daughters needing immediate help. I'll never know who was on the other end of the line, but I used it as an excuse to leave. I walked out of his house and never looked back. I'll admit I missed a few red flags earlier, but once I saw the papers and heard the mention of the cameras, which I doubt were real, I knew I had to trust my instincts. Story 10. He argued with me about my order at the steakhouse. I had asked for my steak to be medium rare, but he insisted it should be well done because the sight of rare or raw meat made him uncomfortable. Then, while I was in the bathroom, he tried to change my order with the waitress. She double-checked with me before making any changes, having overheard our disagreement. I ended up taking my medium-rare steak to go. Story 11. I met up with a guy I'd matched with on Tinder. After chatting for a while and having coffee, he unexpectedly asked, "Want to meet my kid?" I felt a little caught off guard, and although I was clearly uncomfortable, I nervously agreed. We went back to his place, and I met his daughter, who was actually pretty cool. Afterward, he sent her off to bed and then shared a rather heavy story. He told me that the mother of his child had unexpectedly passed away in their kitchen, and now his daughter didn't have a mom. I noticed there were pictures of her everywhere in his home. I mentioned it was getting late and that I needed to leave. Before I left, he asked if he could stroke my stomach and pinch my ass, which felt like a very specific and strange request. I said no. The next day, he texted me, not to ask for a second date, but to ask if I could babysit his daughter. Story 12. I had to cancel the first date we had planned after something really unsettling happened. I met a guy on a dating site and we made plans to go out, but then I got a call from work saying a package had arrived. When I went to pick it up, it was a huge bouquet of flowers. I was totally confused. I asked him if he had sent them, and he said, "Yes, you mentioned you had a bad day last Friday, so I wanted to make this Friday better for you." Normally, I would have been touched by such a sweet gesture. But there was a problem. I never told him where I worked, and I had told him I lived in a large city an hour away for safety reasons. Not only had he found my actual town, but he also found out where I worked. It was an immediate red flag, and I became really scared. Story 13. On our first date, he told me he was in med school at the university in our town. I immediately realized something was off because there was no med school there, but I thought maybe he was just taking pre-med classes or something, so I agreed to go on a second date. During that date, he spent an hour telling me how, after his military service, he worked as a military contractor doing spy work in Iraq, saying, "If you only knew the things I've done." Later, we stopped by his apartment to pick something up, and while I was there, I noticed all his mail was addressed to a different name than the one he had given me. Just then, I miraculously got a work text and told him I had to leave immediately for an emergency. After I let him know that there wouldn't be a third date, he became unexpectedly angry. I started noticing him hanging around outside my apartment, late at night, hiding in the bushes. Eventually, I had to get a restraining order under the name he had given me. I never saw him again after that, thank God. Story 14. I once went on a first date with a guy who was clearly still hung up on his ex. He spent the entire time talking about her, comparing me to her, and even showing me pictures of them together. It was a major red flag and made it obvious that he wasn't ready to move on to a new relationship. As a result, I decided not to go on a second date. Story 15. I went on a date with a guy who unexpectedly brought his 2-year-old along. During our time together, he told me he would be okay with me going out and partying for maybe another year to get it out of my system, but after that, he expected me to settle down. He then went on a strange rant about how important it is for women to have their fun before becoming moms so they're ready to be homemakers. I was 19 at the time and had no idea he even had a kid before that moment. Edit. Out of curiosity, I looked him up on Facebook. Turns out, he's now on his third marriage, and the toddler I met is almost 10. Time flies. Hopefully, his current wife got all of her partying out of her system. Story 16. At dinner, he shared with me that he didn't believe in washing his hands after going to the bathroom, as long as toilet paper was used effectively. Hand washing was obsolete. He said all of this while licking his fingers and digging into a shared basket of appetizers. I was disgusted. LOL. Story 17. I went on a date with a guy who proudly called himself a mama's boy and said no woman could ever compare to his mother. Needless to say, there was no second date. Despite me turning him down multiple times and clearly expressing I wasn't interested, he continued calling and texting me for 2 years until I finally had to change my number. Story 18. It wasn't a full red flag situation, but there were a few things that made this first date the last one. To give some context, I picked him up for the date. He was in a wheelchair due to losing a leg in a motorcycle accident a few years ago, and he had recently had surgery to address some bone spurs. Normally, he wears a prosthetic. We went out for breakfast, and everything seemed fine at first. No big issues with him. But when it came time to pay, his card was declined. He called his dad, who was also his boss, to figure out why his paycheck hadn't been deposited, and after some back and forth, I ended up paying for the meal. He promised to pay me back, which wasn't a big deal at all. These things happen. Afterward, as we were heading back to my car, he made a comment about the last time he was near an RAV4. It was during his motorcycle accident. He had hit one pulling out of a restaurant, which is when he lost his leg. That comment triggered a memory of a conversation I had with my mom about an accident involving my aunt's RAV4, which had been totaled in a similar way. I started texting him, asking for more details about the accident, like where it happened. Long story short, it turned out that it was my aunt who was driving the car that he hit. Not only that, but he was currently in the process of suing her, despite the fact that he was going nearly double the speed limit at the time and didn't even have a license. Needless to say, there was no second date, and I never did get paid back for breakfast. Story 19. I went to the bar to grab another drink, and the bartender wrote down a music recommendation for me on a piece of paper. The guy I was with asked, "Did you just give that guy your number?" I said, "Nope, just swapped music recommendations." He replied, "I was going to knock his block off." I said, "Wow, you have kind of a bad temper, huh?" He responded, "Yeah, how'd you know? See these scars?" One time I was stuck in traffic, and I got so angry I punched my fist through the windshield. I noped out of there after that. Story 20. I met a guy at the grocery store and he asked me out for dinner. Unfortunately, dinner didn't go well. He spent most of the time criticizing me for being a vegetarian. At the end of the night, as we were walking back to our cars and saying goodbye, he asked if he could have a kiss. I politely said no. He asked again. I declined once more, and then he suggested a quick peck on the cheek. I agreed, but as I leaned in, he turned and kissed me on the lips instead. That was definitely the last straw for me. I ignored all his follow-up texts, and the last one he sent said, "Why does this always happen to me?" Story 21. So, this girl and I were sitting in a club when a guy she knew walked by and waved. He greeted her with, "Hey Kate, haven't seen you in a while." As he walked away, she yelled after him, "Yeah, but do you think about me when you perform solo?" The whole club froze and everyone stared. Then, worried that people outside might not have heard her, she repeated the same thing even louder. I decided it was time to call it a night. Story 22. I went on a lovely date with a Korean-American guy in college, and everything was going great until his mom called during our coffee date. She asked him what my name was, and he told her both my first and last name. Then, his expression changed, and he stood up, apologizing profusely. He said, "I'm so sorry, I should have had her look you up before the date." I was really confused, so I asked, "What are you talking about?" Turns out, he hadn't realized that my name was Japanese American. I'm biracial but mostly white passing. His mom had seen my Facebook profile picture, which was of me and my family at the Obon Festival, hosted by the local Buddhist temple and Japanese American Society. Because of that, his mom told him he couldn't date a Japanese girl, so he ended the date right there. Story 23. I was 24 years old when I went on a date with a 32-year-old guy. When he arrived to pick me up, he was holding something, and it wasn't flowers. It was a Bratz doll. Not a collectible or anything special, just a brand new Bratz doll in its box. He said, "I thought you'd like this." He was dead serious about it. I honestly didn't know what to make of it. Was he trying to make me feel younger or something? Either way, it was really unsettling. The whole date felt weird after that. The next day, things didn't get any better. While I was at the grocery store, he kept calling me, and I don't like to talk on the phone while I'm shopping. After a few calls, I caved and called him back. He asked why I had been ignoring his calls, and I explained that I was busy shopping and needed to focus on the people I was interacting with, like the deli worker. He got upset and was genuinely hurt, saying it wasn't fair that I gave grocery store workers more attention than I gave him. That was the last straw for me. Needless to say, there was no second date. Story 24. I once reluctantly met up with a guy who turned out to be a very strange individual. Our conversation took an uncomfortable turn right from the start when he began praising historical figures and making outrageous claims, including denying a major historical event and stating that certain groups of people shouldn't be allowed in the country. To make matters worse, he was making these comments to me, an immigrant myself. He then went on to show me a magic trick, bending a spoon as though he was using telekinesis, and pressured me into trying to solve a riddle that seemed impossible to answer. This all happened in the span of about an hour, which I stayed through purely out of sheer disbelief and morbid curiosity. To top it all off, he told me I wasn't what he was looking for because I was too cold to be the future mother of his children. I guess he was right. I definitely wasn't feeling warm towards him. And as if things couldn't get any more bizarre, he asked if I wanted to come home with him. Needless to say, I made my exit and have never looked back. Story 25. I met up with a guy who showed up in an old, worn-out t-shirt and was covered in sweat. He brought his dog along, but the dog wouldn't even acknowledge me, just stared at him the entire time. He worked as a cell tower technician, and for some reason, he decided he could psychoanalyze me. He claimed that I was afraid of men, despite the fact that we were meeting in a state park. He also went on this strange rant about how he was tired of the usual dinner dates and ice cream and never getting into a real relationship. So, from now on, he said, he was going for doing it first. Then he told me I had a lot to think about. Honestly, I didn't need to think it over. No thank you. His profile had said he wasn't into organized religion, but when we were talking, he mentioned that he actually followed a spiritual guru named Osho from India and had been there a couple of times. To make things even more bizarre, he told me that his wife had passed away just 6 weeks ago. He asked if he could call me, and I agreed, thinking I'd never answer. And sure enough, he never called. I had a good laugh about that. Story 26. There's one date that really stands out. A guy I knew through a mutual friend kept asking if I'd go out for dinner with him. I had to turn him down each time because I had just gotten out of a relationship and wasn't looking for anything new. But my friend insisted that I should get back out there and have some fun, so I finally agreed the next time I ran into him. The date itself went okay. A few awkward moments, but nothing that made me feel like I needed to cut it short. That is, until we got to the bill. He paid with his card and then casually said, "Don't worry, I've got it covered. You can pay me back when we get to my place," with a wink. That was enough to make me realize this wasn't the kind of guy I wanted to see again. So, there was no second date, and he made the trip back to his place alone. Story 27. I went on a date where the guy ordered a huge amount of food without asking me what I wanted. I didn't need that much, and I also have allergies, so I couldn't eat half of it. Then, when the check came, he casually said, "Well, I don't want to be an expletive about it," and suggested we split the bill. I was still in shock, but after a moment I told him I was Jewish. I'm honestly still confused. If he didn't want to be an expletive, the stereotype is that Jews are tight with money, so shouldn't he have offered to cover it? Maybe I'm just still bitter about having to pay for half of that mess. Anyway, dating in North Carolina has certainly been an experience. Story 28. He ordered for me and served a single, tiny slice of wood-fired pizza that barely filled me up. Before I could even ask for another slice, he packed it up and tossed it in the back of his car. Quickly excused myself to call a friend to come pick me up because there was no way I was letting this guy know where I live. It's been almost 2 years, and I'm still salty about not getting more of that pizza. Story 29. Oh man, this was insanity. I'll try to make it brief. I matched with a cute woman on Tinder, and our conversation quickly heated up. She invited me over to her place that night, and I got the impression it was a one-night thing. I was okay with that, so I went. When I arrived, red flag number 1 hit me. She was about 30 to 40 pounds heavier than her pictures. I wasn't overly concerned about the weight, but the fact that she misrepresented herself wasn't great. Still, I was already there and figured I'd go with it. She offered us glasses of wine and we sat down to chat. But then, within 10 to 15 minutes, things took a weird turn. 1. She accused me of having an eating disorder because I mentioned I was training for an upcoming race. 2. She showed me a photo album of her entire family and started talking about how she couldn't wait for me to meet them. 3. She drank 3 glasses of wine in quick succession. When she went to the bathroom, I ordered an Uber. When she returned, I told her I had to leave. She was upset and said, "Most men would at least spend the night." I just replied, "Not me," and left. Story 30. I met a guy from a dating app at a public park, and while he seemed fine over text, things quickly took a strange turn in person. He was an unemployed military vet, and it became clear he had some mental health struggles. As soon as we sat down to chat, he started telling me about his difficult living situation and immediately asked if he could move in with me and my kid. He even offered to watch them while I worked. I was shocked and firmly told him no, as we had just met and I didn't even know him. As a protective mom, I wasn't comfortable with his request at all. The entire time, he was very pushy, getting upset when I didn't go along with the plans he had already imagined for us. Near the end of the date, he asked if I had any interest in actually dating him. I told him very directly, no. That made him angry, and he left abruptly. Not long after, I received a message from him saying he wasted his gas coming to meet me and that I should have at least slept with him since I wouldn't offer him shelter or financial support. It was an incredibly uncomfortable experience, and I was glad I trusted my instincts to end things right there. Story 31. I should have seen this one coming. I went on a date with a girl who got visibly upset when the restaurant mentioned they only had a wine bar and not a full cocktail bar. After dinner, she invited me back to her place, which turned out to be a bit of a mess. She offered me a drink to relax, so I agreed. A few minutes later, she came back and apologized, saying she had finished her whiskey that morning. Then she told me she had recently realized she had a drinking problem. The rest of the date turned into what felt like an hour-long therapy session. Eventually, I asked if I could go home. She texted me later, but I told her I wasn't really ready to date at the moment. Another time, a girl opened our chat on the dating app by asking, "Who are your favorite authors?" I answered and she seemed pleased, so we went out for coffee. I commented on how unique her icebreaker was, and she replied, "I always ask that. I want to make sure there's at least one woman and one minority." Then, she went off on a rant about how people claim to be liberal but don't support liberal authors or date minorities. As a minority, all I could think of was that I was just a token date to add credibility to her liberal views. I eventually stopped seeing her and started dating someone else. Later, she texted me, asking if my then-girlfriend and I wanted to join her woke book club. Story 32. He kicked off our first conversation by saying, "The problem with dating is that men simp too much for women." He then went on a rant about how buying flowers for women is a sign of weakness and that men shouldn't put effort into relationships because they shouldn't have to. He was also 10 years older than me. It was such a missed opportunity. It could have been the kind of age gap story you'd read on Reddit. Story 33. I decided to give a chance to a guy I met on a dating app, even though he wasn't exactly my type. He spent the whole week before our date hyping up this amazing surprise that he had planned but refused to tell me what it was. So, I go into the date not knowing what to expect. First, we get Thai food, which was fine, but then he takes me to a glow-in-the-dark mini-golf place. It was a bit underwhelming for me because I had lived next to one before, so it didn't feel like the big, exciting surprise he had made it out to be. Anyway, we played a round or two, and he clearly thought he was going to win. He started trash-talking to me the whole time, making little jabs and comments. It became more of a competition than a fun date, and it was obvious he didn't handle losing well. Even though the whole secret activity felt a little controlling, I decided to keep going along with it. Long story short, I ended up beating him in the game, and he threw a tantrum about it, acting like a whiny child. When he drove me home, I tried to politely end the evening, but he insisted on walking me to my apartment. Once we got there, he tried to force his way into my apartment, and I quickly shut the door in his face. That was an eye-opening experience. I learned a few important things. Online dating might not be for me. It's not a great idea to let someone pick you up on a first date, since you're stuck with them for the drive, and I definitely shouldn't let anyone know where I live on the first date. Story 34. I went on 2 dates with a girl in my late 30s. During both dates, she didn't ask me anything about myself. She's very expressive and loves to talk, even sending hilarious memes and emojis over text, but when we were together, she just talked about herself the whole time. Not even a simple, "How was your day?" or "How are you?" It was all about her. When I told her I didn't want to pursue anything and thought we should just stay friends, she completely lost it. She started yelling, calling me names like frigging loser and a-hole, telling me I wasn't good enough for her. I was just stunned. She had some serious internal issues, and I calmly told her that she deserved someone who could handle that, but I was definitely not the one. I mentioned that she wasn't really losing anything and that she'd have a chance to meet someone else. That made her flip even more, accusing me of things I hadn't even done, like being selfish and only thinking about myself. I reminded her that we'd only known each other for 2 weeks, not 2 years, and said we were done. She immediately apologized and asked me to stay, saying we could start over. I told her, "No, thank you. Honestly, take it easy with your next date. You might push away a good man if you don't." Then she started sobbing, and I walked away. It was hard not to feel bad for her, as she clearly had some unresolved emotional hurt from previous relationship. We didn't even get physical, and in hindsight, I'm really glad we didn't. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.